I'm Anisa Mehdi with an Abraham Path culture capsule. My guest is anthropologist and pilgrimage scholar Ian McIntosh. Dr. McIntosh is Director of International Partnerships at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis. He founded the Sacred Journeys Project, bringing pilgrimage scholars together from across the world for an annual conference. The author of several books on pilgrimage, Ian is also co-editor of New Pilgrimage Routes and Trails that was released in 2023 by Peter Lang. Welcome, Ian. You are originally from Australia. You wrote 3 books on Aboriginal Australian religion, co-founded Past Masters International, a heritage group working with Indigenous Australians to map and protect heritage areas and sacred sites. What is your personal connection to the Indigenous community?
I spent all of my years before coming to the US in 1997 working with Aboriginal people in a whole range of areas, including Aboriginal health, Aboriginal education, but most particularly in land rights and sea rights claims. So this was a justice initiative. But after 2001, my wife and I, we wanted a change of scene, and both of us went to live and work in the Republic of Armenia, as one does. My wife was working on rule of law reform, and I was working in applied anthropology in the reforestation. It was such a critical need in Armenia at that time because with the breakdown of the Soviet Union, all oil and gas supplies coming from Azerbaijan had been cut. And as one of my colleagues from Armenia said, that God in his or her infinite wisdom sent the coldest winters in Armenian history when they had no means by which to keep themselves warm. And so they started to chop all the trees down all throughout Armenia, especially in the cities. And within a very short time, places like Yerevan were dust bowls. Topsoil was being lost. There was landslides that were covering roads and railroads. Entire villages were being covered. So they needed to do a major reforestation plan because the World Bank had predicted that within 20 years, Armenia would be a failed state.
Did you manage to get reforestation underway?
Oh, yeah. So this was the Tree Project. It's a very significant project that's brought, major changes to Armenia. And of course, this was a pilgrimage site. Every morning you would see the people looking out on Mount Ararat, the great twin peak mountain, which is, the source of Armenian identity and culture.
What brought you to pilgrimage?
It's a very profound story for me, because for many years I used to teach truth and reconciliation studies at university. And of course, in Australia, I was involved in reconciliation work on behalf of the Indigenous Australians. So reconciliation, I would teach, I would give examples of reconciliation projects in places like South Africa and Rwanda, Australia, New Zealand, the Treaty of Waitangi, and elsewhere. Right across the board, we would look at this. Canada, the advances there in treaty making. But at a certain point, I became a little bit disenchanted with the lack of progress in these areas. So I started to, because every peace initiative required concessions, which were often perceived as losses, and people weren't really prepared to do that. And so I started to look at, well, what's a different sort of an approach to peace building? And then I discovered that incredible pilgrimage site in Sri Lanka called Sri Pada. This is Adam's Peak, Sri Pada, the sacred footprint. And I don't think there's any place like this on earth.
From the myth of Adam and Eve?
Yes. So this is a place where people of all faiths climb this mountain from December to February each year, the pilgrimage season. Millions of people will climb this peak in the night and then await on the top for the sunrise. Now, so we're talking about Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Christians, the indigenous peoples. Everybody's climbing with their own ideas of what the significance of the pilgrimage is. Up on the top of this mountain, there's an impression in the rock in a small temple, I guess, but it's not bigger than the average size room. There's an impression on a rock in the shape of a foot. And for the Buddhists, this is the mark of the Buddha when he was in Sri Lanka. Of course, by all accounts, he wasn't in Sri Lanka, but we don't need to go into that. The Hindus will say this was Shiva, Shiva's mark. For the Sufis in particular, when Adam was expelled from paradise, he landed on the top of this mountain and stood on one leg for 500 years in this place. Eve was expelled. When Eve was expelled, she went to Jeddah in Arabia. And up until the early 1900s, where there was an extraordinary mausoleum for Eve, a massive building for her, but unfortunately it was erased by the people at the time because it was too popular as a pilgrimage site. It was contrary to the feelings of the day, which continue. But yeah, so they mark this as the place where Adam came to earth, bringing all sorts of things with him. The Sufi legends are really fascinating. But for me, it was this idea. Well, of course, Christians too believe that this was the mark of Saint Thomas, who had traveled to India in the early years of the first century. But of course, again, Saint Thomas wasn't in Sri Lanka. But nevertheless, when we're talking about a conquering force here, and so they said, well, if we're going to really conquer this island of Sri Lanka, we have to conquer their myths as well. So they tried to supplant all previous stories with the Christian story of St. Thomas. Nevertheless, these stories don't really matter, because when people are climbing, they're climbing together. You don't know if the person next to you is a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim or a Christian, but you walk together. They do common rituals all the way up the mountain, and they give thanks to the mountain itself, which is seen as a sentient being. And then with the sunrise, there's the giving thanks to the sun, which goes back to the original indigenous times. And it really is something to behold, because it's high above the cloud line. So the shape of a perfect triangle appears on the clouds below you, perfect triangle. It's sort of miraculous. People are already there. If we're talking about peace building, getting people to the table, well, they're already there, and they're all walking to a common destination together. And I thought, well, this is just a wonderful example of the ways in which we can be promoting peace building, and pilgrimage was a way of doing that. And so that began for me a sort of an exploration of similar pilgrimages that could have the possibility of bringing people together across lines of division. And of course, I found them throughout India, especially in the poorer parts of India. You'll find Hindus and Muslims, hand in hand in so many of of these pilgrimages, the smaller ones, not the big ones, but the smaller ones. In Ethiopia, you'll find Muslim and Christian joint pilgrimage sites. Lebanon, there's many in Lebanon. But then, of course, I discovered the Abraham Path, and I thought, well, here's a great example. So I've been following the Abraham Path from the very beginning for its potential as for peace building.
But the trails are not necessarily designed the way that you've described. They are now national trails in Jordan, the Jordan Trail, or regional trails, the Sinai Trail. And people get to experience the intimacy of being in a home and great food and personal transformation. But how do we get from walking for the experience and the immersion to walking as a pilgrim?
I think the idea behind the Abraham Path is such a wonderful one. This idea of, potentially uniting Muslim Christians and Jewish people in this trail. It's something that, of course, the challenge is, how do you get all the people there? But of course, there's all the benefits that flow from this in terms of, as you've detailed in your previous programs, and the economic benefits in small villages. But there's also, this awareness of the people and their lives and their challenges. So there's that humanizing aspect. I see pilgrimage as an avenue. You can be proactive in the sense, as a tool of peace building. There's going to be a lot of time out in the wilderness where it's just you and your thoughts about, and your companions, of course. So it's not like, well, here's the itinerary, I'm going to see this one, I'll take the photograph, and then we'll move on to the next one. In 2014, I started the Sacred Journeys project with a view to exploring, of course, pilgrimage in all of its many dimensions, but with peace building underneath there as a priority. So if you come to one of our conferences, at least half of the people will all be talking about that in some dimension. There are a few chapters in this book that are like that, in the New Trails book.
Several times I've reported on the Hajj pilgrimage during Hajj and made documentary films about that. And the struggle that people have to meet one another under circumstances of, staying with their tour operator and staying with their national groups, because that's how it's been organized right now.
I link pilgrimage and peace building very closely. And that's the lens through which I see all of the great pilgrimages, the Camino de Santiago and all of these others. And to what degree do they have the potential for bringing people together across various divides?
You worked on new pilgrimage routes and trails with Dane Munro and Daniel Olson.
They've all been with the Sacred Journeys project almost from the beginning, especially Dane. We began this in Mansfield College, Oxford, back in 2014. And since then, yes, we've collaborated on quite a lot of different projects. I mean, we've had 8 books that have come out, 8 edited volumes on pilgrimage, and 9 special issues. So we've just completed the New Trails, which is the latest book in this series, and we're very excited to have the Abraham Path in there. And I've been wanting to have that covered for some time. And of course, our next book, we've decided we're going to do it on ancient pilgrimage. So new pilgrimage trails, yes, they're proliferating across the world. And in our project, we tend to look beyond the usual suspects. The Rome, Jerusalem, the Camino, and so on. We're looking for other pilgrimages that challenge the accepted definitions of pilgrimages, which are very individual focused, which I object to very strongly. I don't think that's a reflection of a Western mindset. Most pilgrimages are community, or national events. So we're going to go to ancient pilgrimages, looking back as far as we can possibly go. And Dane is looking at the question of immortality, the Gilgamesh stories, and others are looking at the famous stories from China, also again in search of immortality, and sending great numbers of young men and women to Japan in search of the elixir of life. I'm going back even further than that. So in my work in Aboriginal Australia, my interest in religion, I've been looking at, if pilgrimages are universal of the human condition, what does it look like in traditional Indigenous Australian settings where they don't have to go somewhere else? They don't have to go to a sacred place somewhere else because they're right on their sacred lands and they're intimately connected to those sacred lands. And I started to look into this, and I got back to that story of how and why did Indigenous peoples come to Australia in the first place? And really, no one has any satisfactory answers. I mean, this was the first group to leave the continent of Africa about 100,000 years ago. If there were other peoples before that, they were lost. They didn't survive. But the first group migrating out of Africa 100,000 years ago were the ancestors of the Australian Aborigines. And they tracked east, always in the direction of the rising sun, always. Following the coastline, minimizing any changes in their cultural technology. And then they came to a point where they could not go any further. There's 80 or more kilometers of open water. Now, they don't know that there's anything on the other side. Now, most people would say, well, that's it. That's the end of the journey. We stay here in Southeast Asia. But they didn't. They headed into the unknown and populated Australia. And so I'm writing a paper on that. Why did they cross that gap? I call this the very first pilgrimage, this whole movement out of Africa 100,000 years ago. And it was all guided by, in particular, one story from an elder that I worked closely with. I wrote his biography, David Burramurra. It's called The Whale and the Cross. This was my first book. And he talked about how at the very beginnings, he didn't believe in this coming from Africa stuff, although it's pretty well, documented. So I wasn't going to argue with him. He didn't think that. He said, but, around Australia, yes, there was a lot of movement of peoples. And he said, well, when his ancestors came to this place after the last ice age, 10 to 20,000 years ago, and they could go no further, the gods came to them from the rising sun, teaching them all sorts of things. So that, it was as if the rising sun was the place of their desire. It was They had been tracking across the world towards the sun always. And when they couldn't go any further to reach the gods where the sun was, the gods came to them and taught them various things. And then he said, but when we die, the spirits continue that journey and they reside in the rising sun. We can't get there as living beings. Only the spirits of the dead will go there. And so there's these enormous ceremonies when people die and they send the spirit of the dead to the sun. Could this have been one of the causes of pilgrimage from the very outset? They were looking for meaning. They were looking for something. And they knew that something had something to do with the sun because they were always going east. What was driving them onwards? And the sun hypothesis, really struck me like lightning. I thought, my goodness, they were looking for the sun, the source of the sun, the giver of life. This is the chapter that I'll do for the ancient pilgrimage.
The next book.
Follows the new pilgrimage.
Well, some things haven't changed, as you say in the introduction to this book. Since the dawn of humanity, people have traveled in search of meaning and to petition worldly and otherworldly blessings. So that hasn't changed. May not longer be the sun.
Yes.
But there is light, surely, that people are seeking. Light of a variety of sorts. I'm honored to have been invited to contribute a chapter to this book. I worked hard on it, and you worked hard with me, and so did the editors. But I'd like to hear just a couple of other highlights about the book to intrigue and inspire desire among our listeners.
So this theme of new pilgrimages. So I do a daily Facebook post where I collect stories of pilgrimage from around the world, and it'll usually be a news release. And from this daily reading of posts about pilgrimage, I started to select trails that I sort of thought, well, this is a new one. I want to know more about that. Let me reach out to this person to see if I can find out more about that. So and so many of the chapters in this are a product of that, the daily posting on Facebook, which is open to everyone, the Sacred Journeys Project. But so one of the highlights was, of course, the Sufi Trail in Turkey. So we met two people who created the Sufi Trail from Istanbul to Konya, following the ancient pilgrimage route to Jerusalem and Mecca. And so this is just the first section of that trail that they've now signposted, and you can walk over 2 weeks or you can ride over 1 week and so on. And again, there's such a tradition of hospitality towards the pilgrim in these places, which, like with the Abraham Path. I wanted to highlight the pilgrimages in Canada. In Canada, there's a strong awareness, of that you are, walking on treaty land, and that you should be honoring the indigenous peoples as partners in this treaty. Every part of land. Here in Indianapolis, I'm on treaty land too. But I'm telling you, not 1 in 1,000 people will know what treaty that is. It's not in the public consciousness. The paper on Canada is really looking at that question of belonging, respect, and building a future together in partnership with indigenous peoples. Australia, we don't have that because there was no treaties in Australia. They're not on treaty land. They're on what's called terra nullius, the land without people. We've got a paper on the Underground Railroad here in the US, which I was very excited about. And again, it's a new trail.
I'm wondering, what do you hope that this book and others you've written may achieve?
One is trying to reshape the way that we define pilgrimage away from this narrow sort of Western concept of the individual. That doesn't exist. Look at pilgrimages in Peru and Bulgaria and wherever else. It's not about an individual quest. It's the quest of a community to reach community goals. As a researcher of pilgrimage, I'm trying to go as deep as I can into the meaning of these journeys. And so I think at a certain level, pilgrimage is tied up in that quest. How do we build a better world? And of course, I think, if you walk the Abraham Path, don't you feel like a better person, Anisa? Did you feel that?
I feel like I'm in a better world, and I want the rest of the world to know about this world of hospitality and welcome and spectacular landscapes, varied landscapes. It's pomegranate groves and rushing rivers and desert and ancient synagogues and ancient places of worship. It's extraordinary.
Oh, yes. So it's transformative. The act of pilgrimage is transformative. And so it's it's something that I'm very keen on exploring in all its dimensions.
People may go to Amazon.com and look for New Pilgrimage Routes and Trails, co-edited by Ian McIntosh, Dane Monroe, and Daniel Olson. Thank you, Ian McIntosh, for your time, your wisdom, your pursuit, your vision for a better world.